The cruiser tank, also called cavalry tank or fast tank, was a British tank concept of the interwar period for tanks designed to function as modernized armoured and mechanized cavalry. Cruiser tanks were developed after the Royal Armoured Corps were not satisfied with many of the medium tank designs of the 1930s. The cruiser tank concept was conceived by Gifford Martel, who preferred many small light tanks to swarm the enemy, instead of a few expensive medium tanks. There were two main types of cruiser tanks, light cruiser tanks and heavy cruiser tanks. Light cruiser tanks were lightly armoured and relatively fast, for example, the cruiser Mki, while heavy cruiser tanks were more heavily armoured and slightly slower than light cruiser tanks, for example, the cruiser Mk2. The British cruiser tank series started in 1938 with the A9 and A10 cruiser tanks, followed by the A13, A13 Mark II, the A13 Mark III Covenanter in 1940 and the A15 Crusader which entered service in 1941. The Crusader was superseded by the A27 Cromwell in 1944. The A34 Comet, a better armed development of Cromwell, began to enter service in late 1944. The Centurion Tank of 1946 became the universal tank of the United Kingdom, transcending the cruiser and infantry tank roles and becoming one of the first main battle tanks. Mbt Background. Dissatisfaction with experimental medium tank designs of the mid-1930s led to the development of specialized fast cruiser tanks, where armor thickness was sacrificed for speed, and infantry tanks, in which speed was sacrificed for heavier armor. Financial constraints had made it impossible to produce a vehicle suitable both for close support and for exploitation. The thinking was behind several tank designs which saw action during the Second World War. British armoured operations theory flowed from the decision to build two types of tank and equip two types of unit and formation. Cruisers were operated by armoured regiments of the Royal Armoured Corps, established on April 4, 1939, in armoured divisions, some regiments coming from the Royal Tank Regiment, RTR, and some from cavalry regiments converted during the war. Infantry tanks went to Army tank battalions, sometimes grouped administratively into Army tank brigades of the RTR. Small, fast, lightly armed tanks like the light tank Mk6 operated as reconnaissance vehicles. Gifford Martel originated the cruiser concept while Assistant Director and then Deputy Director of Mechanization at the War Office in the 1930s. Martel considered that medium tanks were too complicated and expensive for infantry support, where they would be too vulnerable to anti-tank weapons, and rejected claims that they could fire accurately when moving, so would gain no benefit from their speed. Martel preferred a large number of smaller and simpler tanks to swamp an opponent, instead of a few comparatively expensive medium tanks. Work should continue on a universal tank in the long term, but from 1936–1939, Martel gave much thought to the infantry tank. He did not want medium tank development to be split but saw the logic of it, given the constraints on tank development. Tanks were necessary for mobile operations in armored divisions and for infantry support in attacks on fortified defensive positions. A vehicle satisfactory for both tasks appeared to be impossible to attain. Two types of vehicle led to two theories and procedures: infantry tank thinking coming from the experience of tank operations from 1916–1918, when British tanks had been used for infantry support. Armoured division theory emphasized the speed of cruiser tanks and independent action to protect flanks, attack the opponent's flanks and rear, to counter-attack and conduct pursuit operations. Development. Like naval cruisers, cruiser tanks were fast and mobile for operations independent from slower-moving infantry with their heavier infantry tanks and artillery. When gaps had been forced through the opponent's front by the infantry tanks, cruisers were to penetrate to the rear and attack lines of supply and communication centers in accordance with the theories of J.F.C. Fuller, Percy Hobart, and B.H. Liddell Hart. The cruiser tank was designed for use in a manner similar to cavalry, which made speed the most important factor, and to achieve this, early cruisers were lightly armoured and armed to save weight. The emphasis on speed unbalanced the British designs. On limited engine power, the speed was possible only by sacrificing armour protection, By comparison, infantry tanks operating at soldier's pace could carry far more armor. The idea that speed is armor was considered most important in the Royal Tank Corps. It was not realized that the principle of mobility was a liability against the German policy of accepting lower speeds for superior armor and armament, ensuring that even one round from a German medium tank could easily destroy a cruiser. An even bigger problem for most cruiser tanks was the small caliber of their main gun. The first cruisers were armed with the 2-pounder, 40 mm, gun. This gun had adequate armor penetration against early war tanks, but was never issued high explosive ammunition. This made the cruisers less able to deal with towed anti-tank guns, which became a major issue with the extended combat ranges of the Desert Campaign. The additional machine gun turret, as mounted on the Crusader, was no substitute for He rounds. As the armor of German tanks increased, British cruisers were upgunned with the more powerful 57 mm QF 6-pounder gun, starting with the Crusader Mk3, an interim move pending the introduction of the next cruiser tank. Early Mark of what would become the Cromwell were also fitted with the 6 PDR, but this gun still did not have a satisfactory He round. The Cromwell as planned was to have a high-velocity 75 mm gun, but the design was not sufficient to mount one, and so decided that the new Cromwell tanks would be fitted with the QF 75 mm, a bored-out 6 PDR design that could take US 75 mm ammunition. The new 75 mm gun providing greater He capability at the expense of some armor penetration, however it was still adequate to deal with the majority of German armored vehicles. Part of the Cromwell's success was its high power-to-weight ratio, provided by the adoption of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine as the Meteor, which delivered sufficient power for the Cromwell to have a maximum speed around 40 miles per hour, 64 kilometers per hour, on roads. The new power plant enabled the tank to be far more heavily armored and armed than previous cruiser designs. As the Cromwell could not be fitted with the HV 75 mm, work was undertaken to produce a tank for the powerful 17 PDR anti-tank gun, able to take out the heaviest of German vehicles. To this end the cruiser Mk8 Challenger was developed, mounting a 17 PDR gun on a lengthened Cromwell hull and a totally new turret. The Challenger was an unhappy compromise, though it was popular with its crews. The cut and armor protection to allow the mounting of the larger gun meant it was not well suited to closer range engagements, and it threw its tracks more often than the Cromwell. As the UK had large numbers of US M4 Sherman tanks, an extemporaneous conversion of the Sherman to take a 17-pounder, as the Sherman Firefly, proved effective in providing more 17-pounder gun tanks. The Firefly accompanied Churchills, Shermans, and Cromwells generally at a ratio of 1:4. The production of Fireflies greatly outpaced that of the Challenger, but in Cromwell-equipped units, the Challenger was generally preferred as the Sherman had a slower road speed and inferior cross-country mobility. The culmination of British efforts was the Comet Tank with a cut-down 17-pounder design, the 77 mm HV. The Comet was a further development of the Cromwell, a heavy cruiser tank, which sought to remove the need for 17 PDR armored vehicles, such as the Challenger or Firefly in tank platoons. The Comet reduced its road speed in comparison to the Cromwell to 32 miles per hour, 51 kilometers per hour, in favor of better armor protection and a weapon able to penetrate the armor of the heavier German tanks whilst not sacrificing He capability. The tank had a short service life, as design for the Centurion was already well underway, with the first prototype arriving in 1945. Despite the emphasis on high mobility, most cruisers were plagued by mechanical unreliability, notably the Crusader tank in the hot and gritty desert of the North Africa campaign. This problem was usually caused by rushed development and introduction into service. Most of the early cruiser tank designs were ordered off the drawing board, particularly given the urgent need for tanks following the fall of France. The Liberty engine, which also powered early cruiser tanks, was beginning to show its age and was being pushed to its limit in tanks such as the Crusader. This problem was not fully solved until the debut of the Cromwell tank in 1944, with its powerful, reliable Rolls-Royce Meteor engine. History. Interwar. In 1936, the War Office decided on a light tank for the cavalry, a cruiser tank, a medium tank and an infantry or assault tank. By 1938, the medium tank had stagnated as a research project, in favor of heavier cruiser and infantry tanks, and after the outbreak of war, the move towards heavy infantry tanks capable of breaking through the Siegfried Line, West Wall, on the German border. In 1934, Sir John Carden of Vickers Armstrongs had produced a Woolworth medium tank to a 1934 specification, General Staff No. A.9, for a close support tank, using elements of the medium Mk3 design, which had been abandoned due to financial reasons, but lighter and using a commercial engine to be cheaper. It was accepted as an interim design for limited production as the cruiser tank Mark I. It was expected to be replaced by a Christie suspension design. From 1937–1938, 125 A9s were built. The A9 was lightly armored but capable of 25 miles per hour, 40 kilometers per hour, and carried a highly effective 2-pounder anti-tank gun. The cruiser Mk2, A10, was designed by Carden as an infantry tank, built to the same design with added armor for 30 mm, 1.2 in, of protection. It was insufficiently armored for the role, but as a heavy cruiser, it was put into production in July 1938 as another interim design. It had the same gun as the A9, was the first to be equipped with the Besa machine gun, and 175 MKIIs were produced by September 1940. Experience with the A9 during the Battle of France in 1940 revealed shortcomings, including inadequate armor and a lack of space for the crew, but it saw useful service in France, the Western Desert and Greece in 1941. Orders for the MKI and Mk2 cruisers were limited, for an advanced and faster cruiser tank which would incorporate Christie suspension designed by J. Walter Christie and have better armor. In 1936, General Gifford L. E. Queston Martel, a pioneer in tank design who had published works on armored warfare and pioneered the lightly armored tankette concept to enhance infantry mobility, became Assistant Director of Mechanization at the War Office. Later that year, Martel had watched Soviet tanks at the Red Army's autumn maneuvers, including the Mbt tank, which they had developed from Christie's work. He urged the adoption of a tank that would use the suspension system and also follow the Christie practice of using a lightweight aircraft engine such as the Liberty L-12 engine or a Napier Lion. The government authorized purchase and licensing of a Christie design via the Nuffield organization. The tank A13E1 was rudimentary and too small for British use, but the Nuffield suspension was most effective, and this became the basis of the cruiser Mk3, A13. Following testing of two Nuffield-built prototypes, A13E2 and A13E3, the A13 was ordered into production and 65 were manufactured by mid-1939. The Mk3 weighed 31,400 pounds, 14.2 tons, had a crew of 4, a 340 HP engine which gave a top speed of 30 miles per hour, 48 kilometers per hour, and was armed with a 2-pounder, 40 mm, gun and a machine gun. When it was introduced in 1937, the Army still lacked a formal tank division. The trackless element of the Christie suspension was discarded as adding little value for the extra complexity. The cruiser Mk4, A13 Mk2, had heavier armor than the Mk3 and production started in 1938. World War II. During the first half of World War II it was used in large numbers in the Western Desert Campaign. The contemporary Covenanter was unreliable and was retained in the UK for training use. The Cavalier, Centaur, and Cromwell tanks were the planned successors to the Covenanter and Crusader. Intended to be in production by 1942, the project was delayed and the Crusader was upgunned as an interim measure with the Mk.36-pounder gun. The Cavalier was a development of Crusader. Centaur and Cromwell tanks were an alternative design using the Cavalier engine and the new Rolls-Royce Meteor respectively. The Centaur and Cromwell went into action at the invasion of Normandy. The Comet Tank was a development from medium tanks. During the war, the development of much more powerful engines and better suspension enabled heavier tanks to approximate the speed of cruisers with the protection of infantry tanks, and the concept became obsolete. The Centurion tank was designed to satisfy the heavy cruiser criterion, by combining the mobility of a cruiser tank and armor of an infantry tank in one chassis, which evolved into the universal tank concept to do it all. The Centurion transcended its cruiser tank origins and became the first modern British main battle tank. Cruiser tanks in other armies. The cruiser tank concept was also employed by the Soviet Union in the 1930s, as exemplified by the Mbt tank series, Russian, Bystrokodnya tank. Type armored fighting vehicle. Place of origin Britain. Service history. In service 1937–1945. Used by British Army. Wars Second World War. Specifications. Main. Armament. 2-pounder gun. Secondary. Armament. 7.9 mm machine gun.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.